And welcome to all. So, as you know, Israel does not have a written constitution. Technically, neither does the UK, but we have, I would say, you have a more civilized political life in your country and more respect for tradition. And in the absence of a written constitution, for many reasons, we don't have time to go through history, but when Israel proclaimed its independence, we didn't have the equivalent of the Federalists in America. We were in the middle of a war, and it was pushed off, like most things are pushed off in Israel, never happens. There were also many disagreements on what the constitution should look like. You know how Jews like to argue a lot. When you have two Jews, you have three opinions. Just to the final sentence of the Declaration of Independence was a long argument because the secularists didn't want the mention of God. So at the end of the day, we compromise on an expression which can be understood by any party as they wish. The Rock of Israel, so imagine how long it would have taken for our constitution. So at the end of the day, we only had basic laws, which determine the powers of the judiciary, of the executive, and of the legislative power. The Supreme Court was always the only counterpower to the government, because since we are a parliamentary system, at the end of the day, in parliamentary democracies, the separation of powers between parliament and government is mostly a fiction, because in coalition system, basically the government controls the parliament and vice versa. We don't have two chambers of parliament. We only have the Knesset. We don't have a presidential veto. We don't have a federal system. So the only counterpower to the government is the Supreme Court. And this was used very early on. In the early 50s, the Supreme Court ruled against the government. When the Prime Minister wanted to shut down a hostile newspaper, the Supreme Court very early positioned itself as a reliable and trustworthy counterpower. What happened is that from, I would say, the mid-80s onward, the Supreme Court became more and more activist. Decisions that it would not have taken in the past, it started taking, including on issues that are not purely judicial. Just to give you an example, in 1965, the Supreme Court was petitioned by citizens who wanted to block the appointment, the credentials of the new German ambassador because of his past in the Wehrmacht, and the court said, I understand, but it's not a legal issue, I cannot interfere. Today the court would never say that. And when Israel passed the two new basic laws in 1992 on fundamental freedom and freedom of occupation, then President of the Supreme Court, Aaron Barak, declared, based on those two new basic laws, a constitutional revolution, and 3 years later, in 1995, declared that the court could strike down regular legislation based on those basic laws. And basically, the court declared unilaterally that all of Israel's basic laws constitute a constitution. One of Aaron Barak's colleagues on the bench, who disagreed with him, said, you know, to his colleague, I think it's the first constitution in history that has been unilaterally proclaimed by the court without the knowledge of the people. What I'm getting to is that because Israel didn't have a written constitution, the separation of power evolved in an empiric manner, without public discussion, without public debate. And there was some abuse. I mean, when the Supreme Court, when Aaron Barak decided to use Professor Kotler mentioned before the reasonability theory to strike down government decision, not only because they're illegal, but also if they're unreasonable in the court's opinion, or opening the court to anybody without any limitation, without standing. You know, basically with time, there's been more and more criticism of judicial overreach and activism. It's become also very much like in many European countries, and I'm sure we'll talk about it, a right and left issue, with conservative voters feeling or claiming that their elections are being stolen by a very liberal court. Whether or not this is justified, it's how it is perceived in Israel. And therefore, you do have this proposal by the current government to overhaul the system, but, and here I completely agree with Professor Kotler to what he said before, instead of bringing some balance to the system where currently, basically the court ends up having the last word, even on a matter of policy, instead of having a public debate on how to finally have either a constitution or a basic law on the separation of power in Israel, we're having a radical proposal that instead of bringing balance, would replace one balance with another, where from a overreaching court and judicial activism, you would basically have a de facto consolation of judicial review, of the ability of the government to re-legislate any legislation struck down by the court, and basically to politicize the appointment of the court. I think that it's not a good reform. It goes too far. What we need instead, after 75 years of independence, is to finally have what we deserve, which is a public debate. And again, let me quote Professor Kotler again. In Canada, you had a public debate, you had a national convention on constitutional reform. This is what Israel needs and deserves. Unfortunately, because of the toxic political climate in Israel, endless elections in the past 3 years, a very divisive political system, fed also by the social media, instead of having a public convention on judicial reform and on having agreed upon mechanism of the separation of power, we have a radical proposal. People on the streets who oppose any kind of reform, any change to the system is immediately described as a path to dictatorship. It's of course very excessive, and I think that to finish, we need and deserve a public debate. This has been happening also in many European countries. I think we can also learn from each other, learn from the European experience, and hopefully, that's my last point, the negotiations taking place, which I mentioned last night, under the aegis of President Herzog, to reach a compromise, I very much hope, will enable to produce such a balanced and agreed upon system. Thank you.